I want to reduce the brightness of just these blue areas. If we take the regular course of brightness adjustment, the entire image is going to be dark. Watch how the whites, yellows and the reds are also getting darker. We don't want this, and the solution for that is levels adjustment. So as I move the level slider, you can see that only the blue color is darkening. So this was with brightness and this with levels. In this example, we have a gradient that goes from black to white. Here's the corresponding layer, and now I want to adjust it with the levels adjustment. So we go over here and click on the adjustment icon and then levels. So here's the levels adjustment layer created on top. To open the adjustment properties, double click on this thumbnail here. Now this region is called the histogram, and it shows all the brightness and darkness values present in an image. It has a capacity to show tonal values from pure black all the way to pure white. But obviously in this image, we do not have quite so many tonal values. We have only 9 types, and these 9 values are quite efficiently represented over here by these 9 bars. But what are these 4 tiny spikes, you ask? These are just visual errors made by Photoshop while representing the tones. So if you want to clean up the histogram and get rid of these 4 tiny spikes, you can click on this icon. In this image, we have only 3 tones which are represented here on the histogram. You can see that the image contains equal amounts of black, grey and white. And that's why the 3 spikes have the same height. But what if we have a little more of grey and there's a disbalance, like so? You can see that although the number of spikes is 3 for the 3 tones, their heights are different now. These heights are the proportional representation of the tonal amounts of the image. Since the amount of grey is largest in this image, it has the tallest height in the histogram. Second largest amount is black, and likewise the second tallest height is black here. And since white holds the least amount, it has the shortest height in the histogram. Now first let's have a look at the RGB values of the pixels in the image. For that I'm going to go and open the Info tab. I'm going to hover the cursor on the black bar. So you can see it's pure black with R0, G0 and P0. And quite naturally, the brightness percentage is also 0. As I move to the right, the RGB value increases. Each of RGB is now 28 and the brightness spikes up to 11%. I'm going to gradually keep the cursor moving to the right, so you keep your eye on the changes happening on the RGB values and the brightness value. And of course, they're going to increase as we are moving to the brighter side. This you can see is pure grey. Why? Because each of RGB has 128 and the brightness value also corresponds to 50%. I'm going to keep moving to the right and these values are going to increase. So we end with pure white, which has RGB of 255 each and brightness of 100%. Now suppose you want to darken these midtones without touching the black or white. And you want to darken the midtones in such a way that this bar becomes the new perfect grey. The slider to do this job is this middle one. You can call this the midtone slider as it only affects the midtones. You can also call this slider the grey slider because it is the slider that determines which pixels in an image are going to have perfect grey. Right now the grey lot is sitting below this bar and that's why it is perfect grey. So I'll move the slider here, which is the bar we want to be the new grey, the new perfect grey. Now if I bring up the Info tab and hover the cursor on this bar, we'll see that it is indeed our new perfect grey. It has R at 128, G at 128 and P at 128. The brightness is 50% as well. Also you can see in the histogram that much of the image is shared between the grey lot and the black lot. So this is why the midtones have become darker overall. Suppose now I want the midtones to be lighter. So if we apply some logic, most of the image must now be shared by the grey lot and the white lot, right? Also to add to the problem, I want the midtones to be lighter in such a way that this bar becomes the new perfect grey. So I'll go and move the midtone slider to the left until I've reached this bar. You can easily see that most of the space of the image is now shared between the grey lot and the white lot, and that's why the midtones have become lighter. And now it's time to check if this bar is at all the new perfect grey. So I'll hover the cursor on the bar and it is a perfect grey with each of RGB at 128 and brightness at 50%. And just to quickly mention, you can also use this midtone input box instead of this midtone slider. Next, we're going to talk about the slider for the dark tones or the shadows. Again, we can call this slider the dark lord because this slider determines which pixels in the image are going to have perfect black. Let's say I want the dark lord to turn this bar into perfect black. In doing so, you'll see that the dark lord will not only turn this bar into perfect black, but it will also turn every bar coming before it into perfect black. The corresponding histogram spike for this bar is this one. So I'm going to go and try to move the dark slider to that. You keep an eye on the transition here. If I hover the cursor, I can show you that each of them is perfect black with RGB 0 and brightness 0. Not only that, you can see that the overall image has darkened a bit as well. So this is the before and this is the after. Think of it as some black sun that has expanded through this region. That's why this part of the image that is totally engulfed by the sun is completely black. And since the black sun has come closer to this part, the dark rays have made the region darker. However, you can see that it has no effect on the region which is governed by the white lord. And which region is governed by the white lord? In this example, the white lord is under this bar, right? And there's absolutely no darkening of that bar. Next, we come to the third slider, which I would like to call the white lord. Why? Because it determines which pixels in the image are going to have perfect white. In this example, I want this bar to be perfect white. If I make the white lord to do it, it will turn every bar before it to perfect white as well. So you keep an eye here as I move the white slider. And just to show you, I'll hover the cursor and you can see that all of them are perfect white with each of RGB at 255 and brightness at 100%. And not only that, you can also see that there's an overall brightening of image. It is as if the white sun has expanded here, so this part is completely white. And since the white sun has come closer to this region, it has also become brighter. The only exception is that it cannot affect the region which is governed by the dark lord. And in this example, which bars are governed by the dark lord? Only this one, right? And that's why it hasn't brightened a bit. Now in this example, I've attached color sampler pegs on these two bars to fetch their values. And if you want to know in depth about the color sampler tool, you can check this video out. I'll link it up as well. So this bar with color sampler 1 has 67% brightness, and this bar with color sampler 2 has 33% brightness. Now what I want to achieve is I want this bar to be 50% bright or perfect gray. The best way of doing this is by using this middle slider, right? So I'm going to try just that. Keep an eye here as I do so. This bar is 50% as we wanted. And in the process, this bar came down to 15%. Now what I want to essentially test in this example is if we could use the dark slider to turn this bar into a 50% gray as we have done with this middle slider. So let's reset the image. I'm going to grab the dark slider and move it until this becomes 50. So this bar actually has become 50%. Now you might be thinking, well, we'll use the dark slider then. Why use the middle slider unnecessarily? This bar is 50%, I agree, but just look at the value on this bar. While making this bar 50% gray, it has gone to become completely 0. While in the previous case, when we used the middle slider, this bar was at 15%. So now we know why we should use the middle slider to adjust the midtones. You must have noticed in the previous examples that both the black slider and the white slider can move the midtone slider. For example, I'll demonstrate with the dark slider. You can see it's moving the midtone slider as well. The dark slider has not only just moved the midtone slider, but it has also moved the midtone slider in proportion. Meaning, earlier, the distance between the dark slider and the midtone slider was equal to the distance between the white slider and the midtone slider. You can see that the ratio is maintained here as well. These two distances are equal. The proportion is still maintained even when the midtone slider is moved. Let's say I want the midtone slider here. So the distance proportion is like so. This exact proportion will be maintained if we move either of these two sliders. I'll use the dark slider. Let's compare these two now. And you can see that the distance proportions are identical. We know that the direction of the histogram is like so, meaning it represents the dark tones of the image on the left and the light tones of the image on the right. So basically, the histogram goes from black to white, from left to right. Now to make it simple for us to read the tonal values, you can see that I've deliberately mimicked the histogram to create the image. So naturally, I've placed black on the left and white on the right, and that's how the gradient follows from black to white. So anytime if I move the black slider, you can easily interpret that on the image. So the black is resting on this bar. Easy, right? Similarly, now we have the midtone slider. The perfect gray is now on this bar, and obviously you can understand that the white slider is on this bar now. This is because I've intentionally created the example image in such a way that you intuitively understand what parts of the image these three sliders are affecting. But this won't be the real world scenario. You might get an image that looks something like this. It's just the opposite of what we had before. So now if I move the black slider, locate on the image which areas it's governing. It's still affecting the darker side, right? Only this time the dark side is on the right. Similarly, we can move the white slider. As expected, it's affecting the lighter tones. And it doesn't matter if on the image it's on the left and in the histogram it's on the right. Similarly, we can darken the midtones by increasing the distance between the white slider and the midtone slider. And we'll increase the distance between the white slider and the midtone slider to brighten the midtones. Let's take an even more irregular patterned example. So you can see that the tonal values in this image are all over the place without any structural alignment, so to speak. We can see that this is pure black. Then in descending order of darkness are these bars, as you can see. So if you move the dark slider over here, this bar should be totally black, right? It is. And since in the process the dark slider went past this bar, it has also turned pure black. Here's a comparison for the descending order of whites. So if I move the white slider here, this bar should be perfect white, right? And it is. I can go ahead and settle here, which should make this bar perfect white too. Now let's compare the midtones. I've marked 0 as perfect gray. The negatives are going down darker and the positives are going brighter. If we move the middle slider to -2, this bar should be our perfect gray now. So let's test that. It is. And needless to say, the midtones are getting brighter overall. Why? See how the gap between the middle slider and the white slider has increased. Now let's try darkening the midtones. So we'll have to increase the gap between the middle slider and the dark slider. And the midtones are indeed darkening, right? And since the midtone slider has settled under +2, this bar should be our perfect gray now. Let's take the tonal distribution complexity a notch higher. In this image, the tonal values are all over the place, right? For example, here we have some pure black. We got some pure whites here, and midtones in varying order of darkness and brightness here and there. All of these tonal values are represented here in the histogram. The dark tones are represented on the left, the light tones of the image on the right, and the midtones of the image are represented in the middle. So let's try making the dark tones darker, the light tones even lighter. Maybe I'll drag the white slider so far as to make these triangles completely white. Now let's take a look at the midtones. I would like to make the midtones lighter, and so much so that this triangle becomes near perfect gray. See how it doesn't affect the pure black or the white tones? And now if I want, I can also make the midtones darker, and I'll do so until maybe the cheek becomes near perfect gray. I'm happy with what I have here. Now the tonal complexities in the images are gonna get even more complex because more often than not, we're gonna be using colored images and not just black and white. I'm gonna get into colored images a bit later. Next, we're gonna look at the function of this bar here. Photoshop calls it the output levels. Now if I move and bring the dark slider here, this bar along with this bar will be totally submerged in pure black, right? But what if I say I don't want the supreme darkness of the dark slider to be pure black like this? Can we do that by moving the mid slider to the extreme left? No, we can't, because the mid slider cannot affect any pixel that is governed by the dark slider. Well, then maybe I'll try the white slider. No, it cannot do the job either. The white slider too cannot change the pixels of the dark slider. So what do we do? Here comes output levels to our rescue. The output levels tells the dark slider that okay, I know you are the king of darkness, but I am the emperor. It is I who decide how much darkness you hold by default. Since my left slider is at pure black or 0, your default darkness is also pure black or 0. Let's move this slider and lighten the default darkness value. So this is the new ultimate darkness that the dark slider holds. Now if I move the dark slider here, as I did in the beginning of the example, watch what happens. These 4 bars are now totally engulfed in the darkness of the Dark Lord. Only this time, the darkness of the Dark Lord is not pure black. Now similarly, what if I want the lightness of the White Lord to be not pure white? Can we move the dark slider or the middle slider to make it darker? No, we can't. And that's why we'll resort to the output levels once again. This time we'll be dealing with the slider on the right hand side. It controls the default lightness of the White Lord. Since it is sitting at perfect white or 255, the default value of the White Lord is also perfect white. So let's change its default value by moving this slider to the left. I want the default lightness to be quite dark. See how now the default white is something almost grey. We'll consider it as the new white from now on. So if we move the white slider here, all these bars will be engulfed in the new white. Now instead of using this black slider to turn an image pixel completely black, we can also use this black eyedropper. Suppose I want this bar to be completely black. In the regular method, we would have to drag the black slider here, right? But we won't do that this time. Instead, I'll click on the black eyedropper. Then click on this bar to make it completely black. And like the earlier examples, all these bars coming before it in tonal darkness values will be completely engulfed in black as well. Also keep an eye on the histogram for a certain change to happen. So let's go ahead and do it. I'll click on this bar. And it is how we have expected, isn't it? But the only issue is with the histogram, which recreates itself based on the new tonal values. In this image, we have only 4 tonal values, right? And that is what it depicts. Similarly, we have the white eyedropper corresponding to the white slider. I want these parts to be completely submerged in white. If you want to take the old route, you can of course move the white slider here. But this time we'll be using the white eyedropper. Now let's click on this bar. And there you go. And this time too, it has changed the histogram based on the current image tones. There are 6 tones in this image, and here as well. Last, we have the mid-gray eyedropper. So for example, if you wanted a perfect gray on this bar, we would have moved the middle gray slider here, right? As usual, we won't be doing that this time. Instead, we're going to use the middle gray eyedropper. Let's click on this bar with it. But what's happening? Why is it not working? Let's try this bar, try to make it perfect gray. Nothing. Go here as well. Does nothing either. This is because the middle gray eyedropper doesn't work on a black and white image. So I'll bring in a colored one. In this image, this bar is perfect gray. So if I hover the cursor, you can see that the RGBs are at 128 and brightness at 50%. But just suppose for the sake of this tutorial that when you open this image again on your device, due to some digital glitch, the colors got slightly shifted like so. So this bar is not perfect gray anymore. I'll verify that, and you can see that the RGBs are nowhere close to 128 and also the brightness is at 58%. Therefore, what we are going to do is that we are going to click on this middle gray eyedropper and then click on this bar. Well, it's not perfect 128 for each of RGB, but it's close enough. And it's worth mentioning here that as we corrected the gray, all the other colors shifted closer to their correct values. It is by no means perfect, but at least we have some progress from here. But a question may arise in your mind that instead of making this a perfect gray, what if we want to make this green a perfect gray instead? For that, I'll click on the middle gray eyedropper. And let's bring up the info tab as well for reference. Then I'm going to take the eyedropper on the green band. You can see that it has got RGB values at 70, 188 and 95. We're aiming to make them all 128, right? So let's click with the grey eyedropper and see what we get. Sure, this band has turned grey. It's not perfect, but 123 for each is close enough. However, the main issue with this is look at how the rest of the colors have shifted crazily. They no longer resemble what they used to be, do they? To give you an example, this greyish band has turned purple and this strip used to be yellow, which is now orange. Now let's try to convert this purple to grey. You can see that we have its RGB values like so. They are different values, right? And as long as they have different values and the values are quite apart from one another, it's going to produce some kind of color. But as soon these three values become same or close to one another, it turns the pixels to grayscale. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the purpose of this middle gray eyedropper is not necessarily to produce perfect gray all the time. It just aims to make the pixels lose their color. So when I click here, each of the RGB values might not change to 128 to create a perfect gray. I'm gonna click here and see what they change to. So you see here, each of RGB now holds 108. It's not perfect gray, meaning the values are not 128. But since all the values are same, we lost the color here and it has turned gray. You can also set the default values for these three eyedroppers. I'll double click on the black eyedropper. Right now it's set at perfect black. But let's just make it a little bit lighter. I'll go with this and I don't want to save it. So I'll enter the no option. Now I'll take the dark eyedropper and click here. And it is now a lot lighter, right? Let's try the same thing with the white eyedropper. Let's double click on it. I want the default white to be a little dark. This much is fine. You can save it if you like, but I won't. Now I'll click here with the white eyedropper. And there you go. For the grey eyedropper, we of course have this colored image. I'll double click on the grey eyedropper. Let's make the default grey a bit darker. I'm fine with this and I want you to note its RGB values. I don't want to save it. I'll just click on this bar. But it didn't quite match the tone we aimed for. If I bring up the info and hover the cursor, you can see its values. The tone we selected had an RGB value of 82, which is a bit darker, but what we have here is near perfect grey at 122. So no matter what you set your grey eyedropper with, it's always going to produce a near perfect grey. Here's another example that reviews the same principle. Double click on the grey eyedropper. This time let's go crazy and move it all the way up. I'll not make it the default color, so no. Now I'll go and click. And it's not white, is it? Again, it has created a near perfect grey. You can also set colored tonal values for these eyedroppers. I'm gonna double click on the mid-tone eyedropper. I'm gonna settle with this kind of red. I don't want to make this the default color, so I'll enter no. And unlike before, a colored mid-tone will work on a black and white image. So I'll click on this perfect grey bar and let's see if it converts to the color that we have selected. Well, not exactly. The black and white image has just taken the reddish hue from the eyedropper while retaining its own tonal shades. So even if I take the red mid-tone eyedropper and click here, the image is just going to take the hue and retain its original tonal values. The same effect if we click here as well. So each of these clicks on these three separate bars created the same result. Not only that, even if we click on the black bar or the white bar, it's going to produce the exact same effect as before. And notice, even though we have clicked on the black bar or the white bar, they themselves have no change of color or value. Why? Because we have been using the mid-tone eyedropper tool. So it has only affected the mid-tones, even though we clicked on black and white. Now I'll try some color on the black eyedropper tool. I'll pick the same color as before. Go ahead and click on the black and see what happens. Will it convert to this color that we have selected? Yes, it's the exact same color. What if we go here and click with the black eyedropper tool? The exact same color on this bar too. What will happen if we use the colored black eyedropper tool on this white bar? As expected, the black eyedropper can never affect the white, but of course there's a shift in color and tone in the rest of the image. Similarly, I'll try out the white eyedropper with some color. I don't want it to be a default value, so I'll enter no. So let's take the colored white eyedropper and click here. And it does match. Let's see if the colors match if we click here. Yes, the colors match here as well. Will the colored white eyedropper affect the black bar? Logically, it shouldn't. So it cannot change the black bar, but the rest of the image changes accordingly. Now let's take a real image example for the middle gray eyedropper. Let's say this shirt is gray. I'm not saying absolute gray, but something which is devoid of any color. But you can see that there's a sort of purplish bluish tint to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this middle gray eyedropper. I'll also bring up the info tab so you can see the RGB values. So you can see right now the RGBs have all different values. So to make this shirt gray, all these three values, no matter what they are, should be same, which is exactly what this middle gray eyedropper will achieve. So keep an eye here as I click on this shirt. You can clearly see that the colored tints are gone from the shirt and the RGB values are exactly the same. So here's the before and here's the after. We shouldn't make anything lose its color whimsically. For example, by looking at this image, we know for certain that this region should not be devoid of color. But despite that, if we use the mid-gray eyedropper here by force, it's going to destroy the image. Let's click the mid-gray eyedropper and see what happens. You can see that this region has lost its color and become white, but it has shifted the rest of the colors abnormally and destroyed the image. I'll make use of the black eyedropper tool now. I think this part of the image should be in absolutely dark black shadow, but currently it has a tint to it. So I'm going to select the black eyedropper, take the eyedropper here, and you can see that the RGB values are different, meaning there's definitely some color. To make this part black, all these three RGB values should be 0, right? Let's click and find out. While it's not perfect, it's pretty close to 0, 0 and 0, and quite naturally this region has turned blackish. Not only this, all the other similar regions have also turned black. Now in this image, I'm sure that these regions should be absolutely white. So I'll click on the white eyedropper tool. I can then click either here or here. Let's click here. All the RGB values should change to 255 to make this region white. Let's click and see if that happens or not. Well, the values are very close to 255. And accordingly, we have these regions absolutely white. Now let's take few examples for colored eyedroppers. If we double click on the mid-tone eyedropper, we can see that its default value is set at perfect gray. In this image, I'm pretty sure that this region leans towards a grayish tone. So I'm going to take the gray eyedropper and click there. And suddenly the greenish cast is gone, right? But suppose I don't want to correct this grayish region. Instead of a greenish cast here, I want to have a bluish cast. So I'll double click on the mid-tone eyedropper. Select the blue color I want. Click on this region. And voila! Let's take an example for the white eyedropper tool. If I double click on the white eyedropper tool, you can see that it is set at its default white. Suppose I feel that this region should be absolutely white. So I'll take the white eyedropper and click there. And now this part is white. But what if instead of white, I want this part to be yellowish? I'll double click on the white eyedropper again and select the color. Now let's click here. And there you go. Let's take an example for the black eyedropper. This dark region is already black, but I want to make it purple. I'll double click on the black eyedropper. Pick the color I want. And click on this black. The first thought that comes to your mind when you see this image is that it's really washed. It has no real dark values or darkness. Also, if you reference the histogram, it reflects here as well. See how there's no image content or spike near the dark slider? Most of the image content is around the gray slider, and that's why the image appears quite washed and grayish. Now what do we do to add some black to the dark parts of the image? The darkest parts being here in the histogram. We simply move the dark slider to the part of the image we think should be black. So let's do that and find out what happens. It has blackened the dark portions of the image without blackening the whiter portions much. Alternatively, you can also use the black eyedropper tool to blacken the dark areas. It's quite obvious that these regions should be dark, right? So I'm going to take the black eyedropper tool and click on any one of them. And there you go. There's no highlight or brightness in the parts of the image that should be bright. And you can easily relate to that here on the histogram. There's no content or image pixel under or near the white slider. So if the image pixels cannot go to the white slider itself will go to the image pixels. We know that the right hand side of the histogram represents the brighter pixels of the image. But the whole of the right hand side of the histogram is sitting under the gray slider, and that's why the bright areas are not as bright as they should be. These pixels cannot move towards the white slider to make themselves brighter, but the white slider can sure move towards these pixels. I'll move it in such a way that these regions become whiter. So this was the before, and this is the after. We can also use the white eyedropper tool to brighten the lighter parts of the image. So let's select the white eyedropper tool, and let's say I think this portion should be white. I'll click on it, and there you go. This image lacks both proper darkness and brightness. You can check that here on the histogram. There are no pixels near the black slider and no pixels under the white slider as well. First, I'm going to add some blackness to the dark parts of the image. And then I'm going to add some white to the brighter parts of the image. So here's the before and here's the after. Suppose I want to make her skin darker. And I'm sure that these pixels are represented somewhere over here in the midtones. And earlier in this video, we have learned that to darken the midtones, we have to increase the space between the black slider and the midtone slider. So I'm going to do just that. And keep an eye on the face while I do so. So here's the before and here's the after. At this point, you can say, well, what's the big deal? These dark regions have also darkened along with the midtones. I might as well use the dark slider instead. So let's try that out. I'll keep moving the dark slider until I get the desired darkness over here. Now if you compare this darkness with the darkness of the midtone slider, you will see a huge difference. You can see that with the midtone slider, we have so much detail on the hair, meaning the midtone slider has avoided further darkening of the dark parts of the image, while the dark slider has completely blotted and smudged the dark parts of the image while darkening the midtones. Now we are going to talk about modes while adjusting levels. We have a white image before us, and we know that on a digital screen, white is produced by red, green, and blue lights at 100% brightness. How can we verify that? Well, let's go to Channels. And here you can see all the three components that create the white image. This is the red light, green light, and the blue light. And if we turn on all of them, we get this white. Right now the mode is set at RGB, meaning anything we do on the levels will affect all these three RGB lights. Let me demonstrate that with the output levels. As I move the brightness slider to the left, you will see all these three lights will fade out simultaneously. And since all the three lights are turned off, the screen becomes black. But what if I don't want to turn off these three lights all at once? Maybe I just want to turn off the red light to get a certain color on the screen. You can say, well, that's easy. Turn it off over here. Now it's just the green and the blue lights that's producing the cyan. But what if I don't want to turn off this red light so abruptly? Right now it's totally off, meaning its brightness is at 0%. But what if I want the red light to be at 75%, 50%, or maybe even 25%? The only other thing I can do here is just turn it on, which would be 100% red light. We don't want this, so what do? We come here on the channel modes, and then select the red light. Next, we'll go to the output level slider, and as I move it to the left, it will only dim the red light in varying degrees. Also note the transition of the color here as I go. So instead of turning off this red channel, Select red over here and then fade the red light just as much as we need, because perhaps this is the color you want. Similarly, if we turn off the green light, we get magenta. But other than turn off and on, if we want to adjust the brightness of the green light, we'll have to go here, select the green light mode, and then we can adjust the brightness of the green light however we want. When we completely turn off the blue light, we get yellow. But if we want to fine-tune the brightness of the blue light, we again go here. Select the blue light channel, and then we can play with the brightness of the blue light. Now we have an image which is absolutely black. Now how is a black image formed? If we go to channels, we'll see that a black image is created when all the red, green and blue channels are at 0% brightness. But how do we turn them on? Because in the channels, their visibility is already on. We go to levels. I'm using RGB this time because I want to turn on all the three lights. We go to output levels, grab the black slider and move it to the right. And as I do so, you can see that all these three lights are brightening up simultaneously. You can of course select any of these three modes and brighten that particular light. I'll just show you an example with the red light. So now if I move the dark slider, only the red light will brighten up. Let's explore the concept of the channel modes further with this gradient example. To demonstrate, I'll use the red channel mode. And let's see how the image looks when we adjust the brightness of the red light. So we are getting a gradient of cyan. That's alright, but what happens when we have red selected over here and we want to play with these three sliders instead? The dark slider now says, wherever I am, I'm going to turn off the red lights there. So if I take the dark slider here, all these three bars should be black. So we are going to check if it's true. It is. If I further move the dark slider here, these two bars should also be black. They are. And the combination of these three lights produces this image. Now what will happen if we have red as the mode and we want to use the white slider? The white slider now says, wherever I am, I'm going to turn on the red light. I'll take the white slider over here and you'll see all these four bars will be completely submerged in red. And if I take the white slider here, these two bars should also drown in 100% red. And accordingly, with the red, green and blue, we get this kind of image. And it is also worth mentioning that since it is the white slider, it cannot affect anything which is under the dark slider. So we have the red channel over here. I'm going to grab the white slider and move it to the black. And I'm expecting all these bars will turn full red, but this will stay black. So let's try out and see. And there you go. Since we know that the dark slider has no effect on the white slider, when the red mode is selected and I take the dark slider here, all these bars will turn black, but it won't affect this bar. And the combination of these three lights produces this image. Last, we'll see how the mid-tone slider works when the red mode is selected. This is the perfect mid brightness of the red light. How do I know that? Because the mid-tone slider is sitting on this bar. What if I want to have this mid-red brightness on this bar? I'll take the mid-tone slider and move it there. And we already know, since the distance between the dark slider and the mid-tone slider has increased, the mid-tones have become darker. The resultant of these three lights is now this. What if I want to have the midpoint red over here? Like before, I'll grab the mid-tone slider and move it under this bar. Since the distance between the white slider and the midtone slider has increased, the midtones have brightened. And the combination of these three lights is now producing this image. Let's take a real example for the channel modes. In this image, these areas have a yellowish cast. I want to make these bright areas more whitish. Now to create white, we know that each of red, green and blue lights must be around 100% brightness. So we are going to inspect these channels one by one. We can see that the red light is adequately bright in these areas. Now let's move on to the green light. And it is bright to my liking as well. So now let's move on to the culprit, which is the blue light. Here you can see that the blue light is not as bright as they should be to create white. So I'll go to channel modes, select the blue light, and you can see that not a significant amount of image content has proper bright blue. The brightest blue in this image is represented here, and to add even more blue light to these pixels, we'll move this slider here. And now these blues have become a little bit more brighter than before. Now that we know the concept, let's whiten this image. You can see I've turned on all these three lights so we can see this image. I have the blue channel mode selected. Then I'll move this slider to these pixels that should have a brighter blue. And in the process, these regions should become whiter. So let's try this out. And there you go. Now what if I want these mid-tones to be whiter as well? With the blue mode selected, we'll turn on the blue channel, which I already have, and we already know that to increase the brightness of the midtones, we'll have to increase the distance between the white slider and the midtone slider. So we will do just that. And gradually you can see that the midtones are becoming brighter blue. So with this theory in mind, let's get on with the full image. All the channels are on and we have blue mode selected here. Now I'm gonna go and move the midtone slider to the left. And you can see how this region is gradually whitening up. So here's the before and here's the after. Now we can use these eyedroppers like before with modes as well. We have the blue mode selected and the blue channel is turned on. Like before, we can move this slider here to increase the blue lights on these regions. But this time we'll use the white eyedropper. The white eyedropper now says, whichever pixel you click me on will become 100% blue. So I'll select the white eyedropper and then click on any one of these. And there you go. Try these two out on your own. Let's take another example for the channel modes. Suppose I want to darken just these red midtones around the eyes. Can we achieve that with the RGB mode? Let's go and move the midtone slider to the right. But as I do so, you can see that these regions are also getting dark. Let's see the individual channels to see what error is occurring with the RGB mode. The RGB mode is selected, and first I want to see what it is doing to the red channel. I'm expecting if I move the midtone slider to the right, these red midtones will darken. So while making the eyes dark, these regions also got darkened, and it was unavoidable, right? With the same RGB mode, if you take a look at the green channel, you can see that the area around the eyes is already dark and there's nothing more to darken. So there's basically no need to make any changes in the green channel. It's avoidable, right? But if we move the midtone slider with the RGB mode, it unnecessarily darkens these areas which we don't want. Same if you have a look at the blue channel with the RGB mode. There's nothing more to darken around the eye, so moving the midtone slider with the RGB mode just darkens these areas which we don't need. So out of these three channels, we really just need to adjust the red channel to only darken the areas around the eyes without affecting other regions much. So I'm gonna go here and select red. And then I'm gonna move the midtone slider to the right. And there you go. So this was the darkening with the RGB mode and this with the red mode. So this is all I have for today. Make sure to check the other videos. I'll see you next time. Bye.